Paris in the 1920s was a city unlike any other. The world had just emerged from the shadow of the Great War, and the French capital was alive with a restless energy that never seemed to sleep. Jazz drifted through smoky cafés. Writers scribbled furiously in dimly lit corners, and artists filled their canvases with colors as bold as the new age promised to be. But beneath the glow of gaslights and the glamour of flapper dresses, something darker was spreading quietly through the cobbled streets and golden boulevards. It was a craze whispered in hushed conversations, traded in alleyways, and hidden behind closed doors, a substance that promised escape, comfort, and a dangerous kind of thrill. Heroin had arrived in Paris, and with it, an era of temptation that would change countless lives. For many, the 1920s were meant to be a decade of forgetting. The war, the loss, the aching scars that still lingered in every household. People wanted to feel alive again, to drown the memories of trenches and smoke in music, art, and nights that seemed endless. And in that desperate search for relief, heroin found its way into the veins of the city. It started quietly, almost politely, prescribed in small doses by doctors who believed it could soothe pain or calm anxious minds. But Paris was a city of extremes, and soon, what began as a medical tool became a whispered pleasure among poets, musicians, and those who believed the night was their only true companion. On the Rue de l'Odéon, where the air was heavy with tobacco and philosophy, a young writer named Lucien tapped his pen against the rim of his coffee cup. He was barely 22, with eyes that had seen more death than his words could ever express. Like many of his generation, he carried an invisible weight. Memories of brothers who never returned, friends who were lost before they became men. The war had ended, but for Lucien, the noise had never really stopped. He found a kind of peace in the new Paris, the cafés, the jazz, the clinking of glasses. But that peace was fragile, and as he watched the city around him fall under the spell of something new, he wondered how long it would hold. Across the river, in Montmartre, the streets buzzed with a different rhythm. There, the artists gathered, painters, dancers, singers, all chasing the same thing. A moment of brilliance, a flash of inspiration that would make the world remember their names. Among them was Elise, a cabaret singer with a voice that could make a crowded room fall silent. She was beautiful, but not in the way the magazines liked to show. Her beauty was in her defiance, her refusal to bow to the world's expectations. Each night, she stood beneath the lights, wrapped in feathers and sequins, singing songs about freedom and forgetting. And when the curtains closed and the applause faded, she walked alone through the narrow streets, her coat pulled tight against the chill, wondering if the city's promises were only an illusion. Heroin, in those early years, was not yet a monster to be feared. It was seen as modern, sophisticated, an indulgence of the elite. Doctors wrote prescriptions without much hesitation, and pharmacies sold small glass vials to those who could pay. For the artists, it was a muse, for the wounded, a balm, for the restless youth, an adventure. But with every dose, the city's nights grew a little more hollow, and its mornings a little more gray. Behind the laughter in the cafés, there were whispers of collapsed lungs, of debts unpaid, of families waiting at home for someone who would never return. Lucien first heard the word heroin from a fellow writer, a man with sharp cheekbones and a laugh that never reached his eyes. They had met in a smoke-filled backroom, surrounded by empty glasses and ashtrays piled high. "It clears the mind," the man had said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It makes you forget everything that doesn't matter." Lucien had smiled politely, unsure if forgetting was something he truly wanted. But as the nights stretched on and his words failed to come, the temptation began to whisper louder. For Elise, it began as a gift. A wealthy patron, charmed by her voice, offered her a tiny vial one winter evening. "For the nerves," he said, tucking it into her gloved hand. She had laughed then, not understanding what it was. The first time she tried it, the world softened, the harsh lights of the cabaret melting into a warm glow. Her voice felt freer, her steps lighter. She told herself it was only for the stage, only to keep the music alive. But Paris had a way of turning little things into habits and habits into chains. By 1923, the city was shifting. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing. Champagne flowed, the Charleston played on crackling records, and the streets of Montparnasse glittered with restless youth. Yet, beneath the rhythm, something fragile was beginning to crack. Newspapers hinted at scandals, doctors grew uneasy, and the police, still finding their footing in a world rebuilding from war, began to notice the quiet drift of powdered envelopes from the ports of Marseille to the heart of the capital. There was no single villain, no clear mastermind behind the craze. It was a web of circumstances, overproduction from pharmaceutical companies, lax regulations, and a world eager to numb its memories. In this chaos, fortunes were made and lives were lost. Some claimed it sharpened their art, gave them vision beyond the ordinary. Others vanished from the cafés entirely, their names becoming nothing more than scribbles in forgotten notebooks. Lucien watched as his friends slipped away, one by one. The poet who once wrote of summer nights no longer showed his face at the café. The painter with the wild eyes stopped paying his rent, his canvases gathering dust in the back of a damp studio. And Elise, her laughter became rarer, her songs slower. There were moments when Lucien wanted to reach out, to pull her from the shadows that clung to the edges of her smile. But in a city like Paris, everyone was chasing something, and no one wanted to be the one who said stop. One cold night in December, the Seine was wrapped in mist, and the bells of Notre Dame tolled softly in the distance. Lucien sat on a bench, notebook in hand, staring at the empty page. His fingers ached from the cold, his thoughts restless. He thought of the stories he wanted to write, of the future he was supposed to claim, and of the city that seemed to promise everything yet take just as much away. Somewhere across the river, a carriage rattled over cobblestones, and in that fleeting moment, he felt the weight of the decade pressing down on him. The glittering surface, the hidden cracks, the whispers of a powder that was changing lives in ways no one could yet see. What none of them knew, Lucien, Elise, the city itself, was how quickly the quiet indulgence would become a roaring problem, how a single trend would reshape the heart of Parisian nights. There were warnings, yes, but they were often ignored, dismissed as moral panic or jealousy. After all, this was Paris in the 20s, a city that had survived a war, a city that danced on the edge of dawn every night. Who wanted to hear about consequences when the music was still playing? And yet, somewhere in the shadows of those narrow streets, a story was beginning to take shape. A story of ambition and escape, of medicine turned to poison, of lives caught in a tide they never saw coming. Lucien would soon find himself standing at the edge of it, his pen trembling over the page. Elise would face a choice that would change her path forever. And the city, beautiful and broken, would keep its secrets for just a little while longer. The bells rang again, carrying their echo across the Seine, as the first hints of dawn touched the rooftops of Paris. Somewhere, a vial rolled across a table, stopping just before it fell. Somewhere else, a door closed softly, footsteps fading into the fog. The city was awake now, but the night had left its mark. The craze was only beginning, and none of them yet knew the cost. Would Lucien take that first step into the world he swore he would only observe from afar? Would Elise keep her voice or lose herself in the glow that had already taken so many? And who, if anyone, would dare to pull back the curtain on what was truly happening behind Paris's golden facade? The answers, like the city's morning light, were just beginning to emerge. The streets of Paris seemed quieter in the pale light of morning, but the quiet was deceptive. Behind the closed shutters of cafés and the heavy curtains of hotel rooms, the city was already humming with the hidden movements of its restless inhabitants. Lucien wandered along the riverbank, his collar turned up against the chill. He had not gone home that night. Instead, he had walked, through Montparnasse where the painters slept, past the empty boulevards where the night's echoes still lingered, and now here, where the Seine caught the dull reflection of a waking sky. His notebook remained empty in his coat pocket, its pages as blank as the life he feared was slipping away. Every time he tried to write, the words felt false, like paper masks covering something he could not yet name. He stopped at a vendor, setting up for the morning, the smell of fresh bread rising with the steam from the cart. The man nodded to him, offered a small loaf without a word. Lucien paid and moved on, tearing the bread absently. Around him, Paris was stirring. Horse carts rattled over the cobblestones, and the faint rattle of bottles being unloaded from a delivery truck echoed down the alley. A woman in a faded green coat hurried by, clutching a parcel close to her chest. He didn't know her, yet the hurried glance she cast over her shoulder reminded him of something he had seen too often lately. People moving with secrets, people who once moved freely, but now carried a kind of invisible burden. In Montmartre, Elise stood at her small mirror, the remains of last night's makeup still clinging to the corners of her eyes. Her room was quiet, too quiet for a woman who had just sung to a room full of clapping strangers. The sequined dress hung on the back of a chair, its shimmer dull in the pale light. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, feeling the faint echo of the music still thrumming in her head. The vial was on the table, its glass catching the morning light. She had told herself it was only for the nerves, only to keep her voice steady. But now, as she looked at it, she felt a flicker of unease, an awareness that something was shifting, that the thing which once seemed like a tool was beginning to decide the rhythm of her nights. Her patron, the man with the silver cufflinks, had not returned. He rarely did. He was just one of many who came to the cabaret to be entertained, to forget the world outside. For him, Elise was part of the show, as replaceable as the lights or the musicians. But for Elise, each night was a performance that cost her more than she let anyone see. The city applauded but did not care. And in that indifference, she found herself clinging to anything that could make her feel steady, even if it meant slipping further into something she did not fully understand. By mid-morning, the cafés had begun to fill. Writers argued over newspapers, businessmen spoke in hurried tones, and waiters moved with the weary rhythm of habit. Lucien found himself at his usual corner table, the empty page open before him. Across the room, a group of young men laughed too loudly, their cheeks flushed from the night before. One of them he recognized, a painter who once shared his dreams of leaving something behind that mattered. Now his eyes were glassy, his hands restless as he fumbled with a small pouch beneath the table. Lucien looked away, but the image lingered. The city was beginning to whisper. Not loudly, not yet, but in the back rooms of the jazz clubs, in the dim hallways of cheap hotels, in the waiting rooms of doctors who had stopped asking too many questions, the whispers grew. There were new routes coming in from the south, ships docking at Marseille, carrying more than just spices and wine. There were men in fine coats making promises to desperate musicians, to weary veterans, to lonely cabaret stars. There were rumors of a network that thrived on that desperation, that fed it with a smile and a steady hand. Elise tried to keep her routine unchanged. She rehearsed in the afternoons, walked the same streets to the same cafés, forced laughter when her friends teased her about her sudden fondness for late-night remedies. But the city was always watching, and it had a way of catching those who thought they could hide their cracks. One evening, as she stepped out of the club, a figure waited for her in the fog. Not the man with the cufflinks this time, but someone different, quieter, less polished. He spoke her name like a question, and though she had never seen him before, something in his voice made her pause. He offered her a cigarette, then leaned closer. "You have a voice that could travel far," he said softly. "Don't waste it." The words stayed with her as she walked home, echoing through the narrow streets like the distant sound of the Seine. Who was he? A stranger? A warning? Or something else entirely? And why did his eyes look as though he already knew what choice she would make? Meanwhile, Lucien's circle grew smaller. One by one, the familiar faces at the cafe disappeared, some to sudden journeys, some to quiet sickness, some simply fading from view as though the city had swallowed them whole. He tried to write it all down, to make sense of what was happening, but every time his pen touched the page, the story seemed too big, too tangled. Was it just Paris being Paris, always chasing the next thrill? Or was there something more deliberate behind the shift he felt in the air? One night, he followed a friend to a gathering in an attic above a bakery. The room was thick with smoke, and the laughter had a brittle edge to it. He stayed in the corner, hands in his pockets, watching as the little packets were passed around, as the same words were whispered. It helps you see, it helps you feel, it helps you forget. He thought of Elise then, of her voice carrying over the crowd, of the way her eyes sometimes looked far away even as the spotlight burned bright. Paris had always been a city of masks, but now the masks were slipping. The faces behind them were tired, hungry, searching. They had survived a war only to find themselves in a different kind of battle. One fought not with rifles or trenches, but with nights that promised escape and mornings that demanded a price. Lucien left the attic before dawn, the sound of distant jazz following him down the stairwell. He walked quickly, as if the cold could chase away the images in his mind. The river was waiting, as it always did, carrying secrets beneath its surface. Somewhere out there, Elise was waking to another day of rehearsals and hollow applause. Somewhere, a new shipment was arriving at the docks, bound for hands that knew exactly where it would end up. And somewhere, the city itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, perhaps a reckoning, perhaps a collapse, perhaps just another night. Would he speak? Would she escape? Or would the city, in all its glittering indifference, simply move on, leaving their stories to fade like the smoke above the rooftops? The morning bells rang again, distant but clear, as if reminding them both that time, unlike the city, never paused. The following nights in Paris carried a strange kind of heaviness, the sort that made even the bright lights of Montmartre feel dim. Elise had begun to notice it in the way the streets seemed quieter after the cabaret closed, how the laughter of strangers turned sharp at the edges, how even the music, her music, sounded thinner in her own ears. The man with the silver cufflinks reappeared, his smile as polished as his shoes, and for a moment she thought of asking him why he had given her that first vial. But the words never left her mouth. Instead, she smiled, took his compliment, and walked away with her gloves tucked tight in her pocket, the glass inside pressing lightly against her palm. Lucien, on the other hand, had started keeping different hours. He told himself it was for the writing, that the silence of the late night helped him think. But it wasn't only the silence that drew him out. It was the quiet hum of the city after midnight, when the respectable crowd had gone to bed and the other Paris, the restless, secretive one, came to life. He walked the streets near Pigalle, where the lamps flickered like tired eyes, and he began to recognize the same faces lingering at the corners, the same shadows flitting from door to door. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a second heartbeat beneath the city's ordinary pulse. One evening, as winter pressed its cold fingers against the windows, Lucien found himself at a café that stayed open later than most. The tables were scattered with tired writers, a pair of jazz musicians packing their instruments, and in the farthest corner, a man he had seen once before, the painter with the restless hands. The man looked thinner now, his scarf wrapped too tight, his fingers trembling as he reached for his drink. Their eyes met briefly, and the painter gave a small, hollow smile. "Still trying to write the great Paris novel?" he asked, his voice carrying more bitterness than humor. Lucien shrugged. "Trying, yes." The painter gestured vaguely toward the door. "There's nothing to write that hasn't already been drowned in this city." Lucien wanted to disagree, to tell him that the city still held stories worth telling, but the words caught in his throat. The painter leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They say it started small. Doctors, chemists, prescriptions that came with a wink. But now, it's in the air, in the drinks, in the music. You can't write a story about Paris now without writing about it." Before Lucien could ask what he meant, the painter stood, leaving coins on the table and disappearing into the night. The door closed behind him with a gust of cold wind, and Lucien sat there, staring at the steam rising from his cup, the painter's words lingering like smoke. Elise's nights grew longer. The cabaret was her stage, but the real performances happened after, The quiet exchanges behind dressing room doors, the invitations to private salons where the laughter was too loud and the music too soft. At one of these gatherings, she saw a familiar face, the stranger who had spoken her name in the fog. He was leaning against a marble fireplace, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod, as though acknowledging something she had not yet admitted to herself. Later that night, as she left the building, he caught up with her. "You still have a choice," he said. His voice was calm, not threatening, almost gentle. She stopped, clutching her coat. "A choice in what? And how much of yourself you want to give away," he replied. "This city will take whatever you let it." She laughed softly, though it sounded more like a sigh. "And what about you? Why do you care?" The man didn't answer. He only looked at her for a moment, then turned and walked away, leaving her with the snow beginning to fall in slow, delicate flakes. By early 1924, the whispers had become harder to ignore. Newspapers printed short pieces buried deep inside their pages, warnings about a foreign powder making its way through the city, vague mentions of health concerns. Police reports were discreetly filed, never quite making the headlines. The doctors who once handed out small vials began to hesitate, some stopping entirely, others selling them through back doors instead of over the counter. And for those already caught in its quiet snare, the nights grew longer and the days more hollow. Lucien wrote in bursts, pages that began strong but trailed off into silence. He wrote about soldiers who never returned, about women waiting by windows, about streets that seemed alive with secrets. But he never wrote about the attic gatherings, or the way Elise's laughter had started to sound distant, or the way the city's heartbeat seemed to slow beneath the weight of it all. Some things felt too close to put into words. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking past the cabaret. The street was empty, the sign above the door flickering faintly. He stopped, his breath clouding the cold air, and for a moment he imagined her voice inside, low and smoky, filling the room with something more honest than the applause. But the doors stayed closed, and the night stayed silent. The stranger who had spoken to Elise, the one who moved like a ghost through the city, had a name, though Lucien did not know it yet. He moved in circles that rarely crossed, slipping between the artists and the officials, between the suppliers and the ones they supplied. Some said he had once been a doctor. Others whispered that he worked for the police or for someone even more discreet. Whatever the truth, he seemed to know the city's hidden map, the places where the shipments arrived, the rooms where the needles waited, the people still teetering on the edge. Elise thought of him often, though she told no one. There was something in his presence that unsettled her, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. She had not yet fallen, not completely, but the ground beneath her felt thinner with every passing week. And in the late hours, when the music faded and the city's cold crept in, she wondered how long she could keep her balance. Paris, ever beautiful, ever restless, continued to dance. The jazz clubs played, the artists painted, the poets drank. But somewhere beneath the rhythm, a pattern was forming, a line that connected the docks to the boulevards, the vials to the voices, the shadows to the dreams of those who thought they could master them. Lucien would cross that line soon enough. Elise already had one foot on it, and the city, with its glittering lights and tired dawns, waited with the patience of something that had seen too many stories in the same way. Would the stranger reach them in time? Would the whispers grow into shouts before anyone dared to listen? Or would the decade continue its dance, pulling them both further into a story that had already claimed too many? The bells of Notre Dame rang again, low and distant, marking another morning in a city that refused to pause. Somewhere, a ship was docking. Somewhere else, a door was being locked. And in a small room above a quiet street, a singer held her breath, listening to the silence between the notes. The snow did not last long in Paris that winter. By the time January turned to February, the streets were slick with rain again, and the lamps cast their yellow glow on wet cobblestones that smelled faintly of tobacco and coal. Lucien had begun to drift further from the friends who once shared his days. They still greeted him when they crossed paths, but their conversations had changed. They were shorter, more distracted, full of references to things he was not a part of. At times, he felt as though he were watching the city from behind glass, close enough to hear its music but too far to join in. He spent long hours in cafés, staring at the pages of his notebook, waiting for the words to come. One rainy evening, he stopped at a small bookshop near the river. The owner, an older man with round spectacles, was locking the door, but he recognized Lucien and waved him in. Inside, the smell of old paper wrapped around him like a familiar coat. They spoke briefly about a new shipment of poetry, about the weather, about nothing at all, and then Lucien found himself browsing the shelves, his fingers tracing the worn spines. At the counter, he noticed a folded newspaper, its headline half hidden under a stack of receipts. Unexplained death in Montparnasse. Young musician found in boarding room. No details, just a brief column. No name was given, but Lucien thought he knew who it might be. He left the shop with the damp air pressing against his face, the sound of the Seine just beyond the narrow street. It was the first time he felt a real tremor in his chest, not just the unease of a writer chasing a story, but the fear of someone realizing the story was already too close. Elise, meanwhile, moved through her nights with practiced grace. Her performances were as dazzling as ever. The applause came, the flowers appeared in her dressing room, and the letters from strangers arrived, full of admiration and requests. But behind the curtain, she felt the edges closing in. The cabaret owner had started hinting at new arrangements, private shows, gatherings where the guests were not the usual crowd. "They will pay well," he said, his tone light, his eyes unreadable. "You deserve to be seen by more than just the regulars." She hesitated, not because of fear, but because of the strange pull she felt towards something she could not name. The city had given her a stage, but it had also begun to shape the nights around her. The stranger's warning echoed in her mind more often now. Sometimes she thought she saw him in the crowd, just a shadow near the back, but when the lights came up, he was never there. The patrons grew bolder. One of them, a man with a velvet scarf and the sharp scent of foreign cologne, invited her to a salon on the left bank. "There will be music," he said, "and friends who appreciate what you do." He smiled as he said it, but his eyes lingered too long on her hands. She told him she would think about it, and for the rest of the week, the small vial on her table seemed to glow faintly whenever she passed it. Lucien finally wrote something worth keeping in late February. It was not a full story, just a scene, a woman standing in the snow outside a cabaret, her breath visible, her hands trembling as the city watched without blinking. He didn't name her, but he knew who it was. The words came more easily after that, as if the city had been waiting for him to acknowledge its secrets. He began to walk again at night, not just out of habit, but because the streets seemed to offer more than his own room did. One night, on Rue Lepic, he passed a narrow doorway he had never noticed before. The door was ajar, and faint music drifted out, a soft, slow jazz that did not belong to the bright stages of Montmartre. He stepped inside without quite meaning to. The room was small, crowded, the air thick with smoke and perfume. In the corner, a group of young men leaned over a table, their laughter too quiet, their eyes too bright. A woman in a green dress walked past him, her perfume trailing like a memory. He did not stay long. The air felt heavy, and the whispers were not for him. But as he stepped back into the street, he noticed something tucked into the doorframe, a folded piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. He hesitated, then slipped it into his pocket. The days that followed were restless. Lucien found himself staring at that paper more than once, wondering if it was meant for him or for anyone who happened to pass by. He thought of Elise, of the painter who had disappeared, of the headline in the shop. The city was giving him fragments, and he felt himself being drawn toward them as though the streets themselves had decided he should follow. Elise received another invitation, this one from someone she trusted a little more, a fellow singer, older, wiser, who had been through the same cabaret years before. "Come," she said. "It's just a gathering, nothing like the club. People talk, people share things. It's quiet." Elise agreed, telling herself it would only be once. The night of the gathering, the city was damp and cold, the lamps glowing faintly in the mist. Lucien walked past the same street again, the folded paper still in his pocket. The address led to a building not far from the river, its windows dark, its door half hidden behind an archway. He stopped across the street, watching as figures slipped in one by one. Musicians, a man with a doctor's bag, a woman carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. No one spoke at the door. They simply entered, and the door closed behind them. He did not follow. Not yet, but he felt, more than ever, that the line he had been circling was now within reach. Inside that same building, Elise was shown into a room lit by a single chandelier. The air smelled faintly of wine and something sharper, a scent she could not place. The guests were polite, their voices low, their smiles fixed. A man she had never met offered her a seat. "You sing, don't you?" he asked. She nodded. "We value people like you," he said, pouring her a glass of something clear. "You keep the city alive, and in times like these, that is no small gift." His words were kind, but his hands did not stop moving. Papers were passed, names were mentioned, and every now and then, a small packet changed hands. Elise kept her eyes on her drink, but her mind wandered to the stranger's warning, to the city's quiet pulse beneath the music. Lucien, standing outside, heard faint laughter through the shutters. It was the kind of laughter that belonged to people who believed the night would never catch up with them. He turned to leave, his breath clouding the damp air, but he could not shake the feeling that something had already begun inside those walls, something he would have to face sooner or later. The river flowed on, the bells tolled once more, and Paris, wrapped in its own secrets, prepared for another night. What would happen when Lucien finally stepped through that door? Would Elise find her way out before the city closed its grip? Or was this gathering just the first of many that would draw them both deeper into the tide already rising beneath the cobblestones? The answer waited, just beyond the reach of the next dawn. The air in Paris during the 1920s carried a strange mix of excitement and unease. It was a city trying to heal from the scars of war, yet restless in its search for something to dull the lingering pain. Cafés stayed open late, their windows glowing with warm light while the streets outside grew quieter. Young men, their uniforms long tucked away, wandered with a sense of displacement. Women who had tasted independence during the war years found themselves caught between old traditions and new freedoms. And in the midst of this slow rebirth, there were whispers of a new escape, something far stronger and more secret than the jazz that filled the nightclubs or the champagne that spilled over polished glasses. It often started quietly, almost innocently, in the dim corners of Montmartre or along the narrow streets of the left bank. A name passed between fingers like a folded note, something that promised calm, detachment, a floating moment in a world still trembling from loss. People didn't yet call it plague, not in those early days. To many, it was simply part of the strange, intoxicating atmosphere that Paris offered, a city already known for its nights of blurred boundaries and its days filled with the hunger to forget. Among the young crowd was a painter named Julien. He was not famous, not yet, but his canvases carried the weight of something searching, muted colors that tried to speak for a generation tired of parades and speeches. He spent his days in a tiny studio with a cracked window and his nights in the company of writers, dancers, and men who claimed to know the city's secrets. It was during one of those evenings that he first noticed how the laughter around him sometimes felt too loose, the conversations too fleeting. Someone would excuse themselves for a moment, return with distant eyes, and speak of life as though it no longer pressed so heavily on their shoulders. Julien did not touch it at first. He watched instead, quietly sketching faces that glowed with a strange softness before fading back into the restless crowd. But he felt the pull of that world, the idea that in a small, hidden place there might be a key to peace, even if only for an hour. The war had taken his older brother, and though years had passed, the streets still felt crowded with shadows. Nights were long, and dreams were not kind. The café where Julien often lingered was small, with tables that seemed to tilt slightly toward one another, as if conspiring to bring secrets closer. There he met Elise, a singer with a voice like cracked porcelain, fragile but unforgettable. She spoke of her own past only rarely, in fragments. A childhood near the river, a mother who feared the city's pull, a string of promises that had led her to the stage. Elise was no stranger to the haze that now drifted through Paris. She told Julian it made the songs easier, the nights shorter, the ache in her chest less sharp. But when he asked her if it helped in the morning, she did not answer. Outside, the Seine reflected the lights of bridges that had carried so many across uncertain times. There were rumors that the city's police were beginning to notice the gatherings, the small packages arriving at the port under false names, the sudden quiet in certain rooms where once there had been only noise. But the 1920s in Paris were complicated. The line between indulgence and danger was blurred by music, by art, by a generation unwilling to return fully to the grayness they had known before. Julian began to see how the city itself seemed to change with the nights. Streets that in the day belonged to vendors and children became something different after dark. Doors that looked abandoned opened to whispers and low lights. In those places, men in fine suits brushed shoulders with poets in torn jackets. The word spread in languages from across Europe, a sign of how far the city's reach had grown. Paris was not only a capital of art and ideas, it was also becoming a capital of escape. Elise once told him about a place near Pigalle where the air felt thick with promise. She said it was nothing like the grand clubs or the polished theaters. It was hidden, almost plain, but inside time seemed to bend. People forgot the clock, forgot the streets outside, forgot themselves. Julian didn't know if she spoke of the place or the thing they all seemed to chase, but he listened. It was easier than asking about the mornings, about the cost that seemed to settle like dust in the corners of her eyes. The authorities moved slowly, their attention often drawn elsewhere, to politics, to rebuilding, to the endless negotiations that kept Europe from tipping again into chaos. But in small reports, in scattered meetings behind closed doors, the pattern was being traced. Ships docking with quiet cargo, names repeated in coded notes, a rise in certain ailments whispered among the doctors who still wore their war-born fatigue. The city's journalists caught only fragments, printing stories about strange nights and sudden disappearances, about families who spoke of change they could not explain. Meanwhile, Julian painted. He painted the streets with their leaning lamps, the faces he could not quite remember, the river that held the city together like a slow-moving thread. And each night, the choice waited, not spoken, not forced, but present, like a shadow at the edge of the table. Elise told him the nights were easier when you stopped asking questions. But Julian had always been the one who wanted to see the outline of things, even when they were blurred by smoke. One evening, he followed her after a show. The crowd had thinned, the applause already a memory. She walked quickly, her scarf trailing like a line he could not quite catch. Down one street, then another, into a quarter where the lights seemed dimmer, the stones older. He thought she might turn and ask him why, but she did not. At the end of the alley was a door he had never noticed before, marked only by a faded number. When it opened, a warm scent drifted out, something sweet, something heavy. Elise slipped inside. Julian hesitated, his hand on the cold frame, the night behind him suddenly feeling very far away. The world in that moment felt like it was holding its breath. The city, the river, the old stones of Paris, they all seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what choice would be made next. The nights in Paris had started to take on a strange rhythm. From the bustling boulevards to the quiet corners of Montmartre, there was an undercurrent, soft, almost invisible, but unmistakably present. People were talking, but in hushed tones. Some carried themselves differently, walking a little too fast, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. It wasn't just the jazz clubs or the artists making their way through the fog. There was something else threading itself into the city's veins, something that made the evenings seem longer and the mornings quieter. The stories had begun as whispers. Little rumors passed over café tables about a new indulgence sweeping through the salons and night spots. They called it la poudre blanche, the white powder. It was not wine, nor the green fairy of absinthe that had already made its mark on a generation. This was something newer, stronger, and far more secretive. Heroin. In 1920s Paris, everything seemed to be on the verge of change. The scars of war still lingered in the memories of those who had survived, yet there was an air of defiance against the darkness that had once enveloped the city. People craved light, escape, and a sense of being alive again. The cabarets, the smoke-filled bars, the artists spilling paint onto canvases, they were all part of the city trying to forget, even as it stumbled towards something unknown. But behind that glittering facade was a web of deals, discreet exchanges in backrooms, and hands that passed tiny envelopes with a knowing look. Among those who wandered through this shifting landscape was a young man named Julian. He was neither a poet nor a painter, though he often mingled with both. He worked as an assistant in a small bookstore along the Seine, but his nights belonged to another world entirely. Julian had a curiosity that often pulled him toward the edges of Parisian society, the corners where stories began and ended without ever being written down. He had seen it once, a packet of that fine powder being slipped across a table at Le Chat Noir, and though he hadn't dared ask, he had watched the transformation that followed. The woman who had taken it, a well-known singer at one of the larger cabarets, seemed to drift into a state that was neither joy nor sorrow, but something heavier, more detached. Her songs that night were slower, almost mournful, and yet the crowd applauded her as if she had given them something precious. Julian had heard of others, wealthy patrons, soldiers who had returned from the front, even writers who claimed it brought them clarity. There was a sense that this thing, whatever it truly was, had wrapped itself around the heartbeat of the city. But where did it come from? And why now, when the world was supposed to be rebuilding, finding its way back to stability? Those are questions few dared to ask out loud. The police had their suspicions, but their eyes often turned elsewhere, to the more obvious crimes, the ones that didn't require looking behind the velvet curtains of the city's most celebrated venues. As winter turned to spring, Julian found himself drawn deeper into this unspoken story. It was not only the allure of mystery, but also the faces of those he knew who had changed in subtle ways. A friend who once spent evenings debating poetry now stared blankly at the river, his words slow and scattered. A seamstress who had sewn costumes for the cabaret performers had vanished for weeks, only to return pale and distant, avoiding everyone's questions. They all had the same look in their eyes, something hidden, something heavy. One night, while locking up the shop, Julian noticed a figure lingering near the bridge. It was Margot, a painter he often saw with the other artists in Montparnasse. She was usually lively, full of opinions about everything from politics to color theory. But tonight, her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette, and her gaze never met his. When he called her name, she startled as if waking from a dream. "Julian," she said, forcing a smile, "do you ever feel like this city is holding its breath?" He didn't know how to answer, so he just nodded, watching as she disappeared into the mist without another word. The newspapers had begun to take notice, though their reports were careful and vague. They spoke of unregulated substances making their way from ports along the Mediterranean, of foreign traders who arrived with goods hidden beneath layers of silk and spices. The docks at Marseille were often mentioned, a place where the lines between legal and illegal blurred with each incoming ship. But it was Paris that seemed to be the destination, the heart of this growing craze. And in the cafés, people debated it like they debated everything else. Was it truly dangerous? Was it a passing fad, like so many others that had come and gone? Or was it something darker, something that could not easily be swept away when the fashion changed? Julian began keeping a small notebook, a habit he had taken from the writers he admired. In it, he recorded little moments, a glance exchanged in a darkened bar, a name overheard in conversation, a half-torn advertisement for a new relaxation tonic that claimed to soothe the nerves. The pieces didn't yet form a whole, but they painted a picture of a city caught between memory and desire. Everyone wanted to feel something different, lighter, freer, untethered from the weight of the past. But at what cost? On a rainy evening, he found himself in a small café near Pigalle, where the air smelled of strong coffee and wet wool. A group of men sat at the corner table, speaking in low tones. One of them, an older gentleman with a sharp mustache and a trench coat still damp from the rain, mentioned a name that caught Julian's attention. Duval. He didn't know why it struck him, but the way the man said it, like it was both a warning and an invitation, made his pulse quicken. Duval, he learned later that night, was rumored to be one of the key figures in the network bringing the powder into Paris. Some called him a merchant, others a phantom, for no one seemed to know what he truly looked like or where he could be found. From that moment, Julian's quiet curiosity began to shift into something more dangerous, an urge to understand, to uncover the threads of a story that was being written in the alleys and cellars of the city. He knew the risk. People who asked too many questions often found themselves unwelcome in the places they once felt at home. But he couldn't help it. There was a feeling that something larger was unfolding, and that it was not just a passing trend or a whispered vice. It was a tide, one that could sweep away more than just a few lost souls. Paris kept moving, as it always did. The dances continued, the music played, the lights flickered on the Seine. But for those who were paying attention, there was a faint unease in the way people held their glasses, in the laughter that sometimes came too easily, in the sudden silences that fell over conversations. The city was alive, yes, but perhaps in a way a fever is alive, burning bright before the collapse. And somewhere, in that feverish glow, Julian knew he was not the only one watching. Others, too, were tracing the same faint trail, asking the same quiet questions, wondering how far this white powder had already spread and what would happen if its grip grew tighter. There was no answer yet, only the echo of those whispers and the knowledge that the story was only just beginning to unfold. The rain in Paris did not stop that week. It painted the streets with reflections of old lamps and blurred the lines between the present and what was slowly fading into history. Jacques moved quietly along Rue Saint-Denis, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Every night seemed colder, and the city that once promised freedom now carried a chill of uncertainty. The heroin craze was spreading like whispers in a smoky café, and no one could quite tell where it started or who controlled it. People just said it arrived like a new perfume, sweet, tempting, and leaving something bitter in its wake. The jazz halls remained open, their doors leaking notes into the damp streets. But behind their music were secrets that not even the police dared to write down. Amélie walked the same street that evening, clutching a worn notebook under her arm. She wasn't a reporter, not yet, but she had a way of noticing the quiet things others ignored. The trembling hands of a poet who once wrote fiery verses, but now could barely hold his pen. The pianist who used to smile between notes, but had started forgetting entire songs. The city still danced, but its rhythm felt offbeat, as if something invisible was pulling its strings. Amélie wondered whether the stories she heard were real or just another part of the city's constant drama. She had been told to stay away, that the business with the powders was dangerous, but there was something in her that couldn't turn away when everyone else was pretending not to see. One evening she found herself sitting beside Jacques in a dim café, one that smelled of roasted beans and damp walls. He was older than her, his eyes carrying the weight of nights without rest. Jacques wasn't an addict, at least not in the way people whispered about, but he had lost a brother to that growing shadow. The boy was an artist, a dreamer, and now a ghost that lingered in Jacques' memory. Amélie listened as he spoke, his voice low, almost swallowed by the café's quiet. He told her of names he heard in the dark, of places where crates were delivered at dawn, and of parties where people forgot their own names by morning. There was something beneath all this, a network, a pulse, that kept the city fed with a poison wrapped in velvet. Outside, Paris kept breathing. The Seine moved slowly, almost heavy, as if it too had grown tired. The bridges still carried lovers and drunks, and the market still opened at sunrise with the same shouts and smells. But in the hidden corners, deals were being made that changed lives with a single paper packet. Heroin was not new to the world, but here in the 1920s, it was a new language spoken by the restless and the rich, the broken and the brave. The war had left scars that no monument could heal, and for many, The powder was a way to forget the trenches, the mud, the letters that never came home. For others, it was simply fashion, a daring thrill, something whispered between champagne glasses. Amelie's notebook began to fill with names. Not many at first, just a few mentioned in passing. A singer from Montparnasse who vanished after her third performance. A doctor rumored to sell more than medicine. A club owner whose wealth appeared overnight. Jacques warned her not to write too much, not to keep it all in one place, but she did. She wanted a pattern to appear, a thread to follow through the noise. And the more she wrote, the clearer it became. The craze wasn't just in the streets. It had reached salons, offices, even drawing rooms where marble busts collected dust. The city's heartbeat had quickened, but it wasn't only jazz making it race. At night, she lay awake and thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell. Paris had always had its dark corners. Absinthe in the cafés, secret duels by the river, whispered affairs in gilded rooms. But this felt different. There was a coldness to it, a mechanical rhythm that didn't belong to art or love. It was business, dressed in feathers and laughter, and that made it harder to fight. You couldn't shame a shadow. You couldn't arrest a rumor. And yet, someone was pulling the strings. Jacques kept meeting her, sometimes at dawn by the river, sometimes in the narrow alleys near Pigalle. He spoke of a man they called the gentleman, a figure who never showed his face but whose name carried weight in whispered deals. Some said he was a foreigner. Others swore he was born in the heart of Paris. The mystery only added to his power. And if this gentleman existed, he wasn't alone. Ships came and went, papers changed hands, and fortunes rose quietly while others fell apart. The cafés kept their lights low. Jazz played on. Painters sold their works for less than a night's meal, while a few grew rich in weeks without touching a brush. The divide widened, not only between the rich and the poor, but between those who remembered the old Paris and those who were building something new upon its ruins. Amélie walked through this world with her eyes open, but the more she saw, the less she slept. There were nights when she thought of burning the notebook. Let someone else find out. Let history write its own story without her ink. But then she remembered the faces, Jacques' brother, the poet with trembling hands, the boy who played the trumpet until his lungs gave out. There was a story here that deserved a witness, even if it meant waiting in the shadows. One rainy evening, she followed Jacques to a warehouse near the edge of the river. The city was quieter there, the air thick with coal and damp wood. He didn't say why they were going, only that she should stay close and speak to no one. They watched from behind a stack of crates as a group of men unloaded something from a barge. No labels, no questions asked, just packages wrapped too carefully to be fish or grain. It was the kind of place where a wrong step could leave you in the water without a name. Amélie gripped her notebook tighter. The men moved quickly, their faces turned from the light. One of them laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the rain. Jacques whispered that this was only one of many such places, that the city was riddled with them like veins carrying something not meant for life. And in that moment, she realized the scope was larger than a few names on a page. This was a network that could not survive without permission, without protection. The rain slowed but didn't stop. Somewhere far away, a trumpet began to play. The notes floated over the water, soft and aching, as if the city itself was singing for the lives it couldn't save. Amélie felt the cold reach her bones, but she didn't move. Not yet. There was still something about to happen, something that would pull her further into the story than she ever meant to go. The days grew heavier as the undercurrent in Paris became harder to ignore. On the surface, the city still sparkled with its usual charm. Street musicians played along the Seine. The cafés were full of chatter, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the cool evening air. But if you looked a little closer, if you watched the way certain figures lingered in shadowed doorways, or how some well-dressed men never stayed in the same bar for too long, you could sense the quiet tension spreading. It was in the glances exchanged on dim staircases, the whispers traded over cheap cups of wine, and the sudden silences that fell when an unfamiliar face entered the room. Henri noticed it more than most. He had grown up in Paris, learned its moods the way one learns the changing seasons. and something in this one felt off. It wasn't just about the sudden appearance of foreign powders or the mysterious men who claimed to offer relief from the anxieties of modern life. It was about the strange alliances forming in places where they didn't belong. Politicians seen dining with known opportunists, artists receiving gifts from men with no love for art, and doctors writing prescriptions they knew too well weren't for medicine. Henry's nights were filled with restless walks along the boulevards, his notebook tucked under his arm, trying to capture the shape of what he couldn't quite see yet. Isabel, meanwhile, continued her work in the clinics, watching the city's fragile souls unravel. What had begun as a whisper of a trend, a powder here, a night of escape there, was now becoming a quiet routine for many. The very same faces she once saw attending poetry readings or lectures now came to her pale, anxious, and strangely distant. They spoke in half sentences, eyes darting as though someone were listening. And when she tried to ask where they got it, who had promised them the sense of calm they claimed they needed, they either laughed softly or changed the subject. There was a new name on the lips of the city, one that floated in the haze of smoke-filled cafés and cramped jazz clubs. It wasn't a person at first. It was a place, a small apartment tucked away near Montparnasse where the music played too late and the windows stayed shut. They called it a salon, though it bore little resemblance to the salons of earlier decades. There, the wealthy rubbed shoulders with the desperate, and the young artists came not to discuss their work but to lose their worries for a night. Some left with brighter smiles. Others left with a different kind of hunger, one that couldn't be fed with bread or wine. Julien, the young painter Henri had taken an interest in, was drawn into that very circle. He had been struggling to finish a series he believed would define his career, but the lines wouldn't come together, the colors wouldn't speak. He told Henri, in a late-night conversation over bitter coffee, that he had found a way to silence the noise in his head. Henri pressed him gently, asked what he meant, but Julien only smiled, said he would invite him sometime. A week later, Julien's once vivid eyes looked hollow, like the streets after a storm. Paris was no stranger to strange fads. Absinthe had once filled this same role, after all. But this was different. Isabel insisted when Henri met her one rainy afternoon at a quiet café near St. Sulpice. She laid out her observations with a trembling certainty. Patients with no medical reason for their decline, musicians canceling performances, writers returning advances. It was as though the city was slowly losing its voice, one story at a time. Henri listened, his fingers tapping the rim of his glass, his mind already mapping the connections between the names she gave him. Outside, the rain fell harder, turning the narrow street into a ribbon of reflected light. A man passed by with his collar turned high, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. Henry's eyes followed him, not because he looked suspicious, but because lately everyone did. There was a feeling he couldn't shake, the sense that Paris was being reshaped in quiet corners, and that the story he was writing might not just be about a passing trend. It might be about something that would stain the city for years to come. The jazz clubs became the heartbeat of this underworld. They were where the introductions happened, where the music drowned out the questions. Americans with fast tongues and European accents mingled with poets who hadn't published in months. Deals were struck in the low hum between songs, and more than one promising talent vanished from the public eye after spending a few too many nights in those dim-lit rooms. Isabel visited one once, under the pretext of following a patient's footsteps. She stayed for less than an hour, the sound pressing against her ears like a warning, before slipping away into the cold night with her heart racing. There were others like Henri and Isabel, quiet observers who hadn't yet spoken aloud what they feared, but none of them had the full picture. The city's police seemed disinterested or perhaps too overwhelmed to care. They had other priorities, they said. Post-war Paris had its scars, and the authorities preferred to focus on rebuilding, on keeping the tourists coming, on making sure the cafe stayed open and the lights stayed on. But the real changes were happening in the shadows, where official eyes rarely lingered. By winter, the pattern became harder to ignore. The salons spread. A new one opened in a forgotten theater, another in a townhouse once known for its literary gatherings. The stories of quick fortunes and sudden downfalls began to circulate like urban legends. A banker's son was seen wandering the markets barefoot, muttering about colors he couldn't stop seeing. A pianist, once celebrated in the salons of the left bank, sold her beloved instrument and disappeared from the stage entirely. Every tale was different, yet the thread ran the same. Something had gotten in, and it wasn't leaving. Henry's notebook was filling fast, its pages crowded with names, addresses, odd phrases overheard in passing. Isabel warned him to be careful, that people were starting to notice his questions. He smiled, a thin, tired thing, and told her he had always been careful. But the truth was, the more he learned, the less he could step away. There was a story here, one that went deeper than curiosity or professional ambition. It was about the soul of the city, and whether it could survive the hunger quietly spreading through its streets. And then came a night that would set everything in motion. It was late, the lamps burning low along the boulevard, when Henri spotted Julien again. He was standing outside a cabaret, his coat hanging loose around his frame, his fingers twitching as though counting invisible notes. Henri approached him slowly, afraid a sudden move might send him running. Julien turned, and for the briefest moment, his expression softened, almost as though he had been waiting for someone to stop him. But then a shadow moved at the corner of the street, and the moment was gone. Julien slipped inside, the door shutting with a soft thud, and Henri was left standing in the cold, the night stretching before him like an unanswered question. The nights in Paris were growing colder, yet the allure of its hidden world only seemed to grow stronger. Crowds still filled the boulevards, their laughter echoing against the wet cobblestones, but beneath the surface, the city's rhythm carried a faint tremor of something darker. Julien began to notice how the same faces appeared in different corners of Montmartre and Saint-Germain, exchanging brief nods, passing along envelopes, or stepping into rooms that were locked a second later. It was never loud, never obvious, but always present. One evening, while walking home after leaving Elodie at her studio, he paused outside an old bakery that had closed for the night. From the corner of his eye, he saw a flicker of light in the upper window, someone moving about with a lantern, their shadow long and restless. For a moment, the curtain parted and a familiar figure looked down. Julien couldn't be certain, but it looked like the same man who had given a speech at the café weeks earlier, the one who spoke of a new substance sweeping the streets. At the same time, whispers about the new craze were starting to reach unexpected places. Even Clara, who rarely left her small bookshop, heard strange requests from late-night customers. They asked for obscure travel memoirs and foreign poetry, but always slipped questions between their sentences, probing about certain contacts or small, coded notes hidden in the margins. She brushed them off, pretending she didn't understand, but her hands trembled as she locked the register at closing time. Paris was becoming a city of veiled glances and coded language, where even an innocent errand after dark carried weight. In the theaters, the music halls, and the small underground bars, the craze was no longer confined to the shadows. It was creeping into the very heart of the nightlife that defined the city. Actors rehearsed with strange bursts of energy, then collapsed backstage, their makeup smeared and their eyes distant. Dancers moved with a feverish intensity, as though driven by something more than applause. Those who noticed said nothing. After all, Paris thrived on spectacle, and the show had to go on. But Julien, with his journalist's eye, began to jot down names, places, times, always in his pocket notebook, always in his small, quick handwriting. He wasn't sure yet what story he was writing, but he felt it building around him like a fog. Meanwhile, Elodie's paintings were changing. The soft blues and warm yellows of her earlier work gave way to deep purples and streaks of black that bled across the canvas like spilled ink. She said it was the winter light, the way the city seemed to hum at night, but Julien noticed her hands shaking as she cleaned her brushes. Sometimes she spoke of strange dreams, of running down endless hallways or standing at the edge of the Seine with figures watching her from the opposite bank. They never moved closer, never spoke, just stood there until the dawn broke, and she woke with her heart racing. The police, or at least the part of the force that cared, were aware something was happening. Patrols in certain arrondissements grew heavier, though they rarely stopped anyone of influence. Stories of sudden seizures at the docks circulated, only to be quickly silenced by orders from above. It was said that crates of exotic goods arrived from faraway ports under the cover of routine shipments, hidden among bolts of silk or boxes of rare tea. Few dared to open them, and those who did often found themselves reassigned, transferred, or quietly moved to less visible posts. Julian attended one of the exclusive gatherings one cold January night, not as a participant, but as an observer. He was invited by a publisher who owed him a favor, and curiosity got the better of him. The salon was lavish, candles flickering against gilded mirrors, the air filled with perfume and quiet anticipation. A singer performed near the fireplace, her voice trembling like crystal glass, while in the back rooms, guests whispered and laughed over glasses of something stronger than wine. He caught sight of the same narrow-eyed man again, the one from the bakery window, and this time their eyes met. The man smiled faintly, as though recognizing an old acquaintance, then disappeared behind a velvet curtain. The city outside that night felt unnaturally quiet, as if Paris itself was holding its breath. Clara's shop light still burned when Julian passed by, her silhouette moving slowly between the shelves, but he did not knock. Something told him that the circle tightening around them all was still incomplete, that the story had not yet reached its breaking point. The Seine glimmered under the moon, cold and indifferent, carrying secrets downstream. What no one could yet see clearly was how deeply the trade was entangled, not just with petty dealers or small-time hustlers, but with people in suits, people with titles, people whose names appeared in the newspapers not for scandal, but for charity galas and state dinners. The craze was not merely a whisper on the streets. It was a quiet tide rising behind closed doors. Julian wondered how far it reached, and more importantly, how much Paris was willing to ignore for the sake of its reputation as the City of Light. One morning, as the mist still clung to the riverbanks, he found an unsigned note slid under his apartment door. It contained only a time and an address. No name, no explanation. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, and the paper smelled faintly of tobacco. Elodie urged him to throw it away, to forget it, but his instinct told him otherwise. If the city was speaking to him, this might be his only chance to listen. He arrived at the appointed place, a small café near the Canal Saint-Martin, only to find it empty except for a woman with a fur-collared coat and dark gloves. She didn't introduce herself, but she spoke his name before he could say a word. "You're asking the wrong questions in the wrong places," she said quietly, "and sooner or later, someone will notice." Her warning was not unkind, but it chilled him more than the January air outside. Back at the theater, the rehearsals continued. Clara's shop still opened each day at noon. Elodie painted into the night, her canvases growing darker and more jagged. And Julian kept walking the streets with his notebook, sensing that the moment when everything would unravel was drawing near. The city was awake, restless, and waiting. Would the next shipment arrive as planned? Would the faces in the crowd finally reveal their true purpose? Or would the whole thing burst under its own weight, leaving behind only shadows and unanswered questions? Paris, in those weeks, felt like a stage before the curtain rises, silent, expectant, every actor in place, every light dimmed, the audience holding its breath. And somewhere within that hush, the true heart of the craze kept beating, hidden but relentless, ready to pull another name into its quiet grip. The following winter came in with a cold rain that slicked the cobblestones and blurred the city lights into streaks of silver. Jean stood under the awning of the café, watching the carriages and motor cars pass, his fingers numb around a cup of weak coffee. There had been whispers lately about arrests, about a crackdown, about names that were no longer seen in the usual places. Margot had disappeared for 3 days last week, reappearing with a pale face and a new determination to leave Paris, though she said little about why. Claire continued her routine at the cabaret, though she sang softer now, and the owner had begun closing earlier. It was as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the dim back rooms of the club, the men who once laughed freely now spoke in hushed tones. Their talk shifted from grand plans to quiet caution. Gene found himself drawn deeper into their conversations, not because he wanted what they had, but because the pull of curiosity had become stronger than his fear. He noticed how one man, a quiet one with a thin mustache and an accent that hinted at Marseilles, always carried a folded paper in his coat pocket. Once, when the man left it on the table, Gene caught a glimpse. It was a ledger filled with coded numbers and names that matched no one he knew. By now, the word heroin floated more freely in the air, no longer only a rumor or a curious whisper. Some said it had come to Paris by way of the ports, smuggled among crates of silk and wine. Others claimed it was the doctors, the chemists, the very people meant to heal who had found ways to profit from this powder. The truth, as always, seemed to rest somewhere in the fog between both. Gene wondered how much of what he saw was real, and how much was a shadow cast by people with more power than he would ever have. Claire had begun asking questions too. She met him one evening after her set, her fur coat wrapped tight and her eyes searching the street as if someone might be following. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "how far it all goes? How many lives it touches, without them ever knowing who's behind it?" Gene nodded, though he did not answer. It was not safe to answer such things aloud, even in the chill night air. The city had ears, and those ears were paid to listen. One night, while the rain hammered on the glass, Margot slipped into the cafe looking unlike herself. Her hair was damp, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and in her hands she carried a small package tied with string. She said nothing for a long while, only warming her fingers around a cup and staring at the door. Finally, she whispered to Gene, "It's not just about money. It's about control. They give it to some, take it from others. And the ones who make it all happen, they're not the ones you see." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left, leaving him with more questions than answers. Weeks passed, and the air of the city shifted again. The bright posters advertising the latest shows began to peel in the wind. The music played on, but the dancers smiled less. People who had once boasted of their nights in Montmartre now kept their distance or left Paris entirely for quieter towns. Still, beneath the surface, the trade continued. Couriers came and went, never staying long enough to make a name. Rumors of corruption wound through the streets like smoke, settling in every corner but never forming a solid shape. Gene began keeping a small notebook in his coat, jotting down what he saw. Names, dates, places, things overheard in the rush of a passing crowd. It was not for publication. He was no journalist. But there was a growing sense that someone would need to remember these things, that if the city was to change or survive, its story had to be written somewhere, even in secret ink. He started to see patterns. Meetings that always ended at the same hour, a black car that appeared on Thursdays, a sudden rise in new cafés that opened and closed within months. It was not proof, but it was enough to stir unease. Claire noticed his growing quiet and warned him not to go too far. "Curiosity is a fine thing," she said, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand, "but in this city, it has a cost." Gene asked her once if she had ever thought of leaving, of going to London or New York where the lights were just as bright, but the shadows might be different. She smiled sadly. "Paris has its claws in me. And besides, they say the same things are happening there too. The world's changing, Gene. Not just here." Then, one night in March, the city held its breath for a different reason. A sudden police raid on a well-known club sent ripples through Montmartre. Names were whispered, some familiar, some unknown. Gene was there that night, watching from a narrow alley as uniformed men moved through the crowd, not rough but firm, as if they already knew whom they were looking for. The people on the street scattered like birds, yet the music inside never stopped. It only played quieter, a waltz that seemed to stretch on forever. After that night, things became stranger still. Margot disappeared again, this time for good. Claire continued to sing, but now there were men who stood at the back of the club, silent and watchful, never ordering a drink. Jean wondered if the storm was passing or only just beginning. The whispers grew darker, about shipments that never arrived, about debts unpaid, about a name that kept returning in murmured conversations. La Roque. No one ever described him the same way. Some said he was a businessman, others a phantom, but his name was always said with the same careful tone, as if speaking it too loudly might draw his gaze. Jean thought often of the people he had seen change, the bright-eyed writers who now stumbled through the streets in a haze, the dancers who vanished from the posters, the men who once dreamed of art, but now spoke only of quick fortunes. He wondered if the city itself was feeding on them, or if it was only a stage for a larger play, one written far away and acted out in smoky rooms. The heroine was only part of it, he suspected. There were deeper lines drawn beneath the streets, and they were not easy to see. One evening, as the bells of Notre Dame tolled in the mist, Claire slipped him a folded note. "Keep this safe," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the wind. "And do not read it here." She left before he could ask anything more. The paper felt fragile in his hand, and when he finally opened it alone, in the dim light of his rented room, he found only a single line written in hurried ink. "They are watching the river. Do not go near it." Jean did not sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling as the city murmured below, the river glinting darkly beyond the rooftops. Who were they? And what waited by the river? The next day, he walked past the Seine, its waters swollen from spring rain, and saw nothing but barges and tourists with umbrellas. Yet he felt the gaze she had warned him about, somewhere in the fog. The weeks that followed tightened around him like a net. More rates. More names gone. The cafe emptied out. The club grew tense. The dancers smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes. Paris still glittered, still sang, still offered its soft nights and electric streets. But for those who paid attention, the music was off-key. Something was coming, something that had begun long before Jean ever set foot in the city, and now he was tangled in its threads. And then came the night when a carriage stopped at the corner, the driver tipping his hat to no one in particular. The door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, his coat collar turned up against the chill. He looked around once, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat, and for a moment, Jean felt as though the man was looking straight through the walls, through the rain, through the noise of the city, and directly at him. The nights in Paris had grown restless. The Seine no longer reflected just the glow of street lamps and the faint shimmer of stars. It carried with it whispers of betrayal, ambition, and the unseen forces that fed the city's hunger for escape. Henri walked along the embankment, his coat pulled tight against the breeze that carried the scent of the river mixed with smoke from the cafés still open past midnight. His steps echoed the unease in his chest as he thought about everything he had uncovered. The missing shipments, the coded notes left in coat pockets, the sudden wealth of men who once struggled to afford a decent meal. It was all connected to the heroin craze that had quietly seized the city. Paris was thriving on illusions, but underneath the glittering nights lay a map of power few dared to trace. Julien had grown quieter in recent weeks. The once lively artist, who used to fill their table with sketches and wild ideas, now stared at his drink more often than he spoke. Henri noticed the way Julien's hands trembled slightly when he lifted his glass, the same hands that had once painted dreams on every canvas. He had tried asking, gently at first, then with more urgency, but Julien only shrugged and muttered that the city was heavy these days. It wasn't just Julien, though. Others were changing too. The dancers looked tired. The musicians played with a strange sharpness in their notes, and the late-night laughter in Montmartre felt forced, like a tune played too often. Across town, Elise was piecing together her own fragments of truth. As a journalist, she had seen stories come and go, but this one was different. The more she investigated the rise of this dangerous trade, the more resistance she met, not just from officials, but from people who normally wanted their voices heard. Doors closed faster than they opened, and those who spoke with her often disappeared from the cafe soon after. The trail was slippery, the kind that promised both a breakthrough and a ruin. Yet she couldn't stop. There was something about the way Paris was changing that felt deliberate, as if someone, or many, had decided the city should dance on a knife's edge. Henri found himself drawn into this silent war, without even realizing when the line had been crossed. What began as curiosity had become something heavier. Each night he stayed out later, meeting figures in alleys or in the back rooms of smoky bars, trading notes, hearing whispers. The heroin craze wasn't just a habit of a few lost souls. It was a network, a web stretching from quiet pharmacies to grand hotels, from tiny docks along the Seine to the polished hands of society figures who never seemed to get their names mentioned in the papers. The deeper he went, the more he felt the walls closing in. Julien, meanwhile, had started receiving invitations he couldn't explain. Elegant soirees hosted by people he had never met before, collectors who wanted to see his work, gatherings where the drinks flowed, but the conversations always drifted towards something shadowed, something not spoken aloud. He returned from these nights smelling of perfume and smoke, his mind elsewhere, his laughter hollow. Henri tried to follow once, but the carriage vanished into the maze of streets before he could catch up. Elise sent a note one rainy afternoon, folded neatly, and slipped under the door of the café where Henri often sat. It warned him, without naming names, that some people were watching him now. She didn't say why or how she knew, only that the city had eyes in places one would never imagine. Henri read the note twice before tucking it into his coat pocket, his fingers cold not from the weather, but from the realization that what had seemed like a story for the papers was now far more dangerous. The cafés grew louder as the nights went on, almost as if they were trying to drown out the tension creeping through the streets. Musicians played faster, dancers moved with wilder steps, and bottles emptied quicker than before. But behind the noise, there was a current of fear. People glanced over their shoulders more often. Friends whispered in corners. The police patrolled, but their presence felt more like a show than a solution, their boots clicking on the pavement while the true dealings slipped through the cracks. Henri met with Elise in secret, their conversations brief and never in the same place twice. She carried with her a notebook filled with names, dates, addresses, pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture far bigger than either of them expected. It wasn't just about the drugs anymore. It was about control. Whole neighborhoods were being shaped by this invisible hand. Fortunes made and lost overnight. Lives twisted to serve the needs of people who never showed their faces in public. One night, Julien disappeared for nearly 2 days. When he returned, his clothes smelled of damp stone and stale wine, his eyes darting like a man who had seen too much. He wouldn't speak of where he had been, only muttering that he had made a mistake. Henri pressed him, but Julien shook his head and warned him to leave it alone, that some doors were better left closed. But Henri knew that once a door is seen, it is impossible not to wonder what lies behind it. The rain fell harder as summer faded, washing the streets of Paris but never quite cleansing them. Rumors spread faster than the river itself, of shipments coming from strange ports, of officials being paid to look the other way, of artists and writers vanishing from the nightlife only to reappear months later, quieter, thinner, and unwilling to speak of where they had been. The heroin craze was no longer just a whisper. It was a heartbeat, steady and insistent, feeding off the city's restless soul. Henri felt it pressing closer now. The nights were longer, the silences sharper, the glances from strangers heavier with meaning. He knew he was being followed sometimes, a figure across the street, a shadow that disappeared when he turned too quickly, a familiar shape at the edge of a crowded cafe. Yet he couldn't stop. Elise's notes had become a thread he couldn't let go of. Julien's secret's a wound that refused to heal. The story had become personal, not just for him, but for the city itself. Paris was on the brink of something, and whether it would fall into ruin or awaken from its dangerous trance was still unknown. And then came the night when the streets fell unusually quiet, the cafés dimmer than before, as if Paris was holding its breath. Henri stood at the edge of Montmartre, the wind cold against his face, clutching a letter that had arrived without a name, only a time and a place. It promised answers, But in the city's shifting shadows, promises were as fragile as smoke. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a faint melody played, soft, slow, and haunting. It was a tune he had heard before, tied to the nights when the heroin trade moved unseen beneath the glow of the city's lights. He knew this was leading to something bigger, something that would either shatter the silence or bury it forever. The question was, who else would still be standing when the truth came to light? The nights in Paris were growing longer, and the air felt heavier with each passing day. It was as if the entire city had taken a deep breath but had forgotten how to let it go. The streets that once welcomed carefree laughter now echoed with hurried steps and whispered conversations. Elise found herself walking alone more often, tracing the edges of neighborhoods where the glow of gas lamps flickered uncertainly against the wind. She had begun to notice things, tiny shifts in the mood of the people she passed, the way strangers seemed to share a knowing glance before vanishing into alleys, the way the bistro owners no longer stayed open past midnight unless they were part of something they did not want to name. Jean, too, was restless. His sketches had taken a darker turn, filling with shadows and ghostly figures that seemed to linger at the edges of every cafe he visited. He rarely spoke of the things he saw at night, but Elise could read it in the lines of his face. He had been in Montparnasse when a musician collapsed during a set, his trumpet clattering to the floor while a small packet slid from his sleeve. No one said a word as two men quietly carried him out the back door. The music continued, but the mood in the room had shifted like a storm cloud creeping over a sunny day. There was talk now of a new network forming within the city, something far bigger than a few bad decisions or unlucky nights. It was said to cross the Seine and stretch from the smoky clubs of Pigalle to the grand boulevards where the wealthy sipped their champagne. The authorities were beginning to take notice, though they spoke of it only in hushed tones. Raids were whispered about, but rarely seen. Elise had overheard a pair of officers arguing at a corner cafe, one insisting that this was a matter that reached far beyond the city, the other saying nothing but staring into his coffee as though it might answer for him. The cafés became both sanctuary and stage. People like Lucien still filled the tables, laughing louder than the tension allowed, their bravado a mask that fooled no one. He had started hosting gatherings at his apartment, claiming they were for art and literature, but everyone knew there was something more at play. Guests left with quickened steps, their eyes darting down the stairwell. Elise attended one such evening. Clutching a notebook she hardly opened, and found herself seated next to a woman in a fur stole who smelled faintly of lilac and smoke. The woman's fingers trembled as she sipped her wine, though her words were sharp as she spoke of opportunity, freedom, and escape. Elise couldn't tell if she was speaking about art or something else entirely. Meanwhile, the city's rhythm began to fracture. Certain nights felt alive with promise, while others were thick with unease. A famous actor was said to have disappeared after a late rehearsal, his dressing room left in perfect order except for a single empty vial on the table. Rumors spread quickly, but names were never mentioned aloud for fear of who might be listening. Even the newspapers danced around the truth, their headlines teasing its scandal without ever laying it bare. Jean grew more withdrawn as the days passed. His work began to sell again, but he seemed almost resentful of it. Elise found him one evening in a dim corner of the Café de Flore, sketching the reflection of a man who hadn't noticed him watching. The figure was tall, impeccably dressed, and surrounded by an air of quiet menace. "Do you know him?" Elise asked, but Jean only shook his head. "Not yet," he said, and turned the page before she could ask more. What no one spoke of openly was the way the city itself felt altered. The Seine carried a different sound at night, as if the river was keeping secrets beneath its dark surface. Markets closed earlier, and the once lively chatter of Montmartre grew cautious, interrupted by glances over shoulders. It was said that a new tide was rising, something that had no name in public but plenty in private. The craze, the temptation, the thing that moved like smoke through keyholes and filled the lungs of those who swore they would never be caught in it. One evening, Elise followed Lucien out of a bar in the Marais, her curiosity outweighing her caution. He walked quickly, his hands buried in his pockets, and turned into a narrow lane she had never noticed before. A door opened just as he reached it, spilling a thin band of yellow light onto the stones, and in that moment she saw faces, too many for such a small place, leaning close together, their voices low but urgent. The door closed before she could catch a single word. The following morning, Paris awoke to news that another cafe had been raided, though nothing was seized and no arrests were made. It was becoming a pattern. Sudden searches, quick exits, no answers. People began to wonder if the whole affair was meant to unsettle them rather than stop anything at all. In the markets, fishmongers shook their heads and muttered that it was always the same. New rules, old games. The artists tried to carry on. There were still exhibitions, still poetry readings, still clinking glasses and smudged paint on fingers. But the glow of the 1920s, once so golden, was dimming at the edges. Behind every burst of laughter was a pause. Behind every dance was a glance toward the door. Elise felt it most in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city held its breath and even the bells seemed hesitant to ring. One night, as the wind curled through the alleys and the lamps flickered low, Jean appeared at Elise's door with a folded letter in his hand. His face was pale, his voice tight. "You need to read this," he said, and set it down on the table between them. The envelope bore no name, only a small smudge of ink where one might have been. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting elegant but rushed. It spoke of shipments and crossings, of names they both recognized but dared not say aloud. It hinted at a meeting, a night soon to come, and a decision that would change everything. Elise looked up at Jean, her heart pounding in her throat. "Where did you get this?" she asked. But he only stared at the window, where the city lights seemed suddenly too far away, and said, "I think we're in the middle of something now, whether we meant to be or not." The night was colder than anyone had expected, the kind of cold that sank into the bones and made the silence feel heavier than it should. The town seemed quieter too, almost unnaturally so, as if everyone had decided to stay indoors, waiting for something to happen. Rebecca could feel it in her chest, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way her instincts told her that the calm was only hiding something far more dangerous. Navarro walked beside her, his eyes scanning the narrow street ahead, the dim light from the flickering street lamps casting sharp shadows that shifted with every step they took. It wasn't just another lead they were following now. It felt bigger, more deliberate, and far too calculated to be coincidence. The files they had recovered earlier that day had opened a new door they weren't ready for. Hidden among the coded notes and vague references was a name they didn't expect to see, one that had been buried under years of silence. A person who was supposed to have disappeared long before any of this began. Someone who had been linked to the earliest cases, someone whose involvement had been quietly dismissed, even erased. But now, there it was in black ink, tucked between old case numbers and strange initials that matched the ones marked on the victims. It was enough to make Navarro stop in his tracks, his breath catching for a moment as he stared at the page like it had betrayed him. They didn't talk much as they drove out toward the edge of the city. The road wound through patches of forest and broken concrete, the kind of forgotten area where nothing good ever stayed buried for long. Navarro kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting a car to appear where none should be. Rebecca kept her eyes on the horizon, her thoughts running through every possibility. Who had left those files behind? Who had wanted them to find it? And more importantly, why now? It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like an invitation, and invitations like that never came without a price. When they finally reached the address, the place was silent. A long-abandoned warehouse sat at the edge of a crumbling parking lot, its windows blacked out, its doors chained but not locked. Navarro killed the engine and waited, letting the sound of the cooling metal fade into the night. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice low, not wanting to break whatever spell the place seemed to hold. Rebecca nodded. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the weight of something waiting inside. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old paper. Their flashlights cut through the dark, illuminating dust that danced like slow-moving ash. It looked like no one had been there in years, but the tracks on the floor, told a different story. Fresh, careful steps that didn't belong in a forgotten place like this. They followed them, moving deeper, their breaths fogging in the cold air until they reached a small room at the far end. The door was ajar, as if waiting for them. What they found inside changed the direction of their investigation entirely. There were photographs pinned to the walls, each one marked with red string connecting them like a map of secrets. Faces they recognized stared back at them. Victims, witnesses, even some names from the task force itself. But at the center was a face they didn't expect. Someone they both thought they could trust, someone who had been helping them from the very beginning. Navarro stepped closer, his jaw tightening as he traced the string that led from one photo to another, each connection forming a web that was more than just a theory. It was a plan. Suddenly, a noise echoed from somewhere behind them. The sharp creak of a door or the crunch of glass beneath a boot. Rebecca signaled for Navarro to stay quiet, her hand instinctively moving toward her sidearm. They waited, listening. The sound came again, this time closer. Whoever it was knew they were there, and they weren't running. They moved back toward the main hall, the sound of footsteps now deliberate, slow, almost taunting. The shadows moved, and for a moment, Rebecca thought she saw a figure standing at the far end, just out of the light's reach. But when Navarro swept his beam across the space, it was empty. Only the echo of something left behind. An envelope on the floor, its edges curled and marked with the same strange symbol they had seen before. Inside was a single line written in hurried ink. "You're too close to stop now." Navarro exhaled sharply, a mix of frustration and grim realization. "They want us to keep going," he muttered, glancing at Rebecca. "This isn't about hiding anymore. It's about control." The words hung heavy between them, the truth settling in deeper than they wanted to admit. Someone was playing with them, leading them from one discovery to the next, pulling the strings while staying out of reach. And whoever it was, they knew every step the two agents would take. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere far off. The city lights glimmered in the distance, cold and indifferent. Rebecca pulled her coat tighter and looked at Navarro. "We can't pull out now," she said quietly. "If we stop, they win." Navarro didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over every name, every clue, every moment that now seemed to carry a different meaning. What they didn't know was that another thread had already been pulled. Back in the city, someone else was watching the investigation unfold. A person who had their own reasons to keep certain truths buried, someone willing to step in before the agents dug too deep. A message had already been sent, one that would change everything once it was received. And when it was, the lines between ally and enemy would blur even further, leaving Rebecca and Navarro wondering if they had been chasing the right ghosts all along. As they drove back, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of questions that neither of them could answer yet. Who had left the files? Who was behind the photos on that wall? And why had the people they trusted most been connected to it from the very start? Each question only made the night feel colder, each mile bringing them closer to a truth that was waiting like a shadow, just out of reach. The air in the room grew heavier as the night stretched on, and each passing minute seemed to press down on everyone's nerves. The evidence they had uncovered so far had only deepened the uncertainty, and the whispers that trailed their every step began to feel more like echoes of something watching them closely. Rebecca sat at the edge of the table, fingers drumming absently against the wood, her eyes locked on the scattered notes that held more questions than answers. Navarro leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on his chin as if trying to draw sense from the chaos. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence thick with the weight of what they were beginning to suspect. There were patterns emerging in the details, strange alignments of dates, missing logs, faces that appeared in places they never should have been. And each thread they pulled only led them deeper into a web that felt deliberately spun to trap the truth. Outside, rain pattered softly against the windows, and the dim glow of a flickering street lamp cast long, shifting shadows on the walls. The sound was almost hypnotic, like a steady heartbeat beneath the surface of the night. Rebecca finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. What if we're looking at this from the wrong angle? What if this isn't about one incident or one person? What if it's about all the things we're not meant to see? Her words hung there, not as a suggestion, but as a challenge, and Navarro's brow furrowed slightly. He knew she was right. Every lead they had chased so far had been carefully placed, as if someone wanted them to follow the trail but never reach the end. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a game with rules they couldn't yet see. The phone buzzed on the table, its vibration loud in the quiet room. Rebecca glanced at the screen, then frowned. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something about it felt deliberate. She answered without hesitation, putting on speaker. A distorted voice crackled through the line, low and almost calm. "You're getting close, too close. Stop digging where the ground is hollow." Before either of them could respond, the line went dead, leaving only the empty hum of the disconnected call. Navarro exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening on the edge of the table. "They know we're here," he muttered, the words barely above a whisper. But it wasn't fear in his voice. It was resolve, the kind that comes when the stakes rise and turning back is no longer an option. The message only added another layer to the mystery, and as they traced its origin, they found it routed through a series of unlisted relays, each one more obscure than the last. Someone wanted to scare them, but also someone who had access, reach, and confidence that they could watch without being seen. Rebecca leaned closer to the screen, her mind running through the implications. "This isn't random," she said. "It's a warning, but also a test. They're watching to see what we'll do next." Her voice carried that mix of tension and quiet defiance that had kept her going through worse nights than this. Navarro nodded slowly, his thoughts spinning. The investigation wasn't just about uncovering facts anymore. It had become personal, a challenge drawn in shadows. As the night deepened, they decided to split their focus. Navarro would dig into the background of the strange figure they had caught on camera near the old facility, the one whose name kept vanishing from official reports. Rebecca would revisit the archives for any overlooked details, especially those connected to the incidents that seemed too neatly forgotten. Hours passed in the dim glow of monitors and the rustling of old files, until a sudden knock at the door cut through the stillness like a blade. They froze. It was well past midnight, and no one should have been there. Navarro signaled Rebecca to stay quiet as he moved toward the door, his hand brushing the concealed handle of his sidearm. When he opened it, the hallway beyond was empty, except for a small envelope lying just at the threshold. He bent down, picked it up, and brought it inside. There was no writing on the outside, no stamp, no indication of who had left it. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, but clear enough to make out the details. It showed the same corridor they were sitting in now, taken from an angle near the ceiling corner, as if from a hidden camera. The timestamp in the corner was from earlier that night. Someone had been here, watching them close enough to deliver a message without being caught. Rebecca's stomach tightened as she stared at the image. "They're not just watching from a distance," she said slowly. "They're inside." The realization shifted everything. The sense of unease they had felt wasn't paranoia. It was presence. Someone had moved freely through the same space they thought was secure, and the envelope was proof that the game had already moved to its next level. Navarro placed the photograph on the table, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about information," he said. "This is control. They want us to feel the pressure, to make us hesitate. But if anything, the warning had the opposite effect. It steeled their determination, even as it made the shadows seem longer and the night colder. From that point, every step felt heavier, every sound a little sharper. They began to check every angle, every reflection in the dark glass of the windows, every flicker of movement in the corner of their vision. Outside, the storm picked up, wind rattling the panes as if echoing the growing tension inside. Rebecca went back to the files, pulling out a name she had glossed over earlier, one that kept appearing at the edge of different reports, but never at the center. It was the kind of name that might belong to an observer, someone who moved between places without leaving a trail. Navarro, meanwhile, unearthed a strange pattern in the security logs from the old facility, power fluctuations at precise intervals, always on the nights when key evidence had disappeared. As they compared notes, a chilling possibility began to take shape. What if the incidents they were investigating weren't isolated cover-ups, but rehearsals? What if each one had been a test, refining a process that was now reaching its final stage? The more they pieced together, the clearer it became that they were no longer chasing a single thread. They were standing in the middle of a larger design, one that had been set in motion long before they arrived. The night dragged toward dawn, the city outside still and dark, but neither of them felt the weight of time anymore. It was as if the world around them had slowed, holding its breath for what would come next. They knew they were close to something, close enough that those in the shadows were starting to close in. And as they prepared for their next move, neither could shake the feeling that the real story had only just begun, and that whatever they uncovered next would change everything, for better or worse. The air grew heavier with every passing hour, as if the walls of the city itself were pressing in on those involved. Mark's thoughts raced as he pieced together the fragments of what he had uncovered. Yet the puzzle felt like it was only expanding, not narrowing. Every answer led to two more questions, and each path he followed seemed to twist into a darker one. The second phone call came at dawn, short, sharp, and unsettling. A distorted voice simply said, "You're looking in the wrong place. It's not just about what happened. It's about why they let it happen." The line went dead before Mark could respond, but it rattled him more than he cared to admit. It suggested something far larger, something systemic, and far beyond a single act or decision. Julia arrived at his apartment soon after, her face pale from another sleepless night. She carried a folder under her arm, filled with documents that hadn't been meant to leave the department's archive. They spread them out on the table, sifting through faded photographs, redacted memos, and transcripts that hinted at surveillance orders never officially sanctioned. Each page painted a picture of a network that had been watching, recording, waiting. But for what? Julia's hands trembled as she read aloud certain passages, ones that made her question the very people she worked for. "This goes deeper than any of us thought," she whispered, more to herself than to Mark. Meanwhile, the city seemed to react in quiet, unsettling ways. People began acting differently around them, strangers glancing twice as if recognizing faces they shouldn't know. A black sedan parked across the street lingered longer than it should have. Calls dropped at the exact moment certain names were mentioned. It wasn't just an investigation anymore. It felt like they had stumbled into a trap that had been set long before they even started looking. The pressure on both of them grew, and with it, so did their resolve. They couldn't turn back now. Too many threads had been pulled, and the fabric of the truth was starting to tear. In the midst of their search, they found a name that kept surfacing, an informant, known only as Lewis. He was a ghost in official records, a shadow in the periphery of every file, every report, never fully identified, but always present when something crucial shifted. Finding him became their next step, their only viable lead. Mark managed to trace a series of transactions to an old warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, a place abandoned for years but still somehow receiving power. They went there at night, careful to park blocks away, and approached on foot through the mist that rolled in from the river. The warehouse was cold and silent, its windows opaque with grime. Inside, the air smelled of rust and dust. In the dim light of their flashlights, they saw makeshift living quarters, a cot, a desk cluttered with old notebooks, and a small radio still warm from recent use. Lewis had been there, maybe only hours before. Among the scattered papers was a map, marked with pins and circles that stretched across the city like a web. In the center was a date, just 3 days from now. It was enough to make their hearts pound. Something was coming, something big. As they gathered what they could, a sound behind them made Julia freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the far side of the warehouse. Mark signaled her to stay low as they backed toward the exit, but the shadows shifted and a figure stepped into the faint light. It wasn't Lewis. It was someone else, someone who knew they were coming. His face was calm, too calm for someone caught in a place like this. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any threat. "You've drawn attention you can't shake." The man didn't pull a weapon, didn't advance, but his words carried enough menace to make them both pause. "They'll come for you now," he added. "Not because you're close, but because you're starting to matter." With that, he stepped back into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as he appeared. By the time they reached the street again, the car was gone, and so was any trace of who he was. But the message lingered like smoke. Over the next 2 days, the city seemed to tilt on its axis. Julia received an anonymous envelope at her office containing only a photograph. Her and Mark, taken from a distance, time-stamped from the previous night. No message, just the image. Mark found his apartment door ajar when he returned one evening. Yet nothing had been stolen, just rearranged, as if someone wanted him to know they had been there. Friends stopped returning calls. Colleagues avoided eye contact, and the few who dared to speak to them did so in hurried whispers. And yet, amidst the tightening grip around them, a second twist emerged, one neither of them anticipated. The files Julia had taken were not complete, but they contained an overlooked clue, a recorded testimony from years ago, dismissed as unreliable at the time, now resonating with everything they had uncovered. The speaker mentioned a meeting that had been arranged to decide how far the cover-up would go and who would be sacrificed to protect the rest. That meeting, according to the tape, had taken place in the same building where the upcoming date on the map was marked. The realization hit them both with the force of storm. This wasn't about one individual or one crime. It was about a pattern, a cycle that repeated itself whenever something too dangerous for the public eye threatened to surface. And now, by digging where they weren't supposed to, they had placed themselves in the path of that cycle. The second twist wasn't just in the evidence. It was in their own fate becoming intertwined with it. They decided to move separately for a while, hoping to draw less attention that way. Julia went to meet a retired officer who had once been involved in the early stages of the case, someone who had disappeared quietly from the force without explanation. Mark followed a lead that took him to the outskirts of town, to a locked archive, said to hold the original tapes before they were edited. Each step forward felt like a step onto thinner ice, the cracks spreading beneath their feet. As night fell again, a storm rolled in, sweeping the streets with wind and rain that masked their movements, but also made everything feel more uncertain. The clock was ticking toward that marked date, and the forces that had once stayed hidden were beginning to surface. Watching, waiting, calculating. Every choice now carried a weight neither of them had fully understood when they started. And somewhere in that darkness, Lewis was still out there, holding the piece that could either expose the truth or bury them with it. The night deepened, and the air grew heavier as the small group in the room exchanged uneasy glances. The walls seemed to hold their breaths, the ticking of the old clock on the wall echoing louder than before. Everything had led to this moment. The months of waiting, watching, and chasing shadows now converged into one final move. The documents on the table were spread open, the names and dates written in a rushed hand. Each one carried weight, each one a link in the chain that had been pulling tighter around them. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about survival. The truth they had been chasing had claws, and it was ready to strike back. Navarro stood by the window, his eyes tracing the faint lights flickering across the street. His fingers twitched against the glass, restless. "They're here," he murmured, his voice low enough to make everyone freeze. Rebecca turned her head slowly, her chest tightening as she tried to read the reflection of shadows moving outside. This was it, the moment when everything either fell apart or came together. They had gambled everything on this night, trusting that the plan they had set into motion would hold. But plans rarely survive the weight of reality. The door rattled once, then twice. A heavy silence fell before a single knock echoed. It was not a polite knock. It was deliberate, forceful, like a warning before the storm. Navarro moved his hand toward the side of his jacket, but didn't draw. Rebecca signaled him to wait. She stepped closer to the door, her heart thudding against her ribs. When the door opened, it wasn't who she expected. Standing there was a man they thought had vanished, a man whose name had been whispered like a ghost, someone whose trail had gone cold months ago. His face carried the lines of someone who had been running too long, and his eyes darted to every corner of the room, as though expecting an ambush. "Close the door," he said sharply, his voice cracked but firm. "We don't have time." Rebecca hesitated but obeyed. The sound of the latch clicking back into place felt like the start of something irreversible. The man stepped forward, dropping a small, worn-out folder on the table. "You've been chasing the wrong thread," he said, his words cutting through the thick air. "It's not who you think it is. They've been using the chaos to move freely while you've been busy looking the other way." Navarro frowned, leaning over the table. "What are you talking about?" "We've followed every lead, every pattern." "That's the point," the man interrupted. "They gave you the patterns. They wanted you to follow them. Every step you've taken has been right where they wanted you." He opened the folder, revealing a photograph that made Rebecca's breath catch. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone inside their circle, someone they had trusted. The room erupted in a low, tense murmur. Questions flooded the air: why, how, when, but no one could find steady ground. Rebecca gripped the edge of the table, her mind reeling back through the months of surveillance, the meetings, the half-smiles that now felt like warnings in disguise. The betrayal cut deeper than she wanted to admit. All this time, the answers had been beside them. The man's hands trembled as he pointed to the next page. "They're moving tonight. They know you're close, and they're going to burn everything. Evidence, witnesses, all of it. If you don't act now, everything is gone." The weight of his words pressed heavily on the room. Navarro clenched his jaw, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. "We don't even know if we can trust you," he said, his tone sharp. "You don't have to," the man replied, his voice quieter now. "But you'll see I'm not lying. They're coming here, and you have minutes, not hours." Rebecca looked at Navarro, their silent exchange enough to make a decision. They didn't have the luxury of trust anymore, only instinct. And instinct said to move. They gathered the files, each one more fragile than the next, and packed them quickly. Every movement felt amplified: the rustle of paper, the soft scrape of shoes, the distant hum of an engine outside. Then, just as they were ready to leave, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and went out. The room was swallowed by darkness, the air instantly colder. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder, closer. Navarro's hand went to his side. Rebecca's breath held tight in her chest. The man who had returned from the shadows stood frozen, his face half lit by the weak glow of the streetlight outside the window. "It's them," he whispered, barely audible. What followed happened in fragments: glass breaking somewhere down the corridor, a door slamming, hurried footsteps scattering like frightened birds. Rebecca motioned for them to move toward the back exit. Each second stretched like a thread about to snap. When they finally reached the narrow stairwell, the echo of boots on the floor above sent a chill racing down their spines. Outside, the night was thick with fog. It wrapped around the alley like a curtain, swallowing sound and shapes. They moved quickly, keeping close to the walls, each step deliberate but desperate. Behind them, the building they had just left erupted in a sudden blaze of light, as if every secret inside had decided to burn rather than be exposed. And then, just as they turned the corner, the second twist of the night revealed itself. Waiting at the end of the alley was not an enemy, but another familiar face, one they thought had been working alongside them, one who had shared their plans and strategies, one who now stood there holding the very evidence they had risked everything to protect. His eyes met Rebecca's, and for a brief moment, there was no anger, no fear, only cold certainty. "You should have stayed out of this," he said softly, almost regretfully, before disappearing into the mist with the folder in hand. The night held its breath once again as Rebecca and Navarro realized the ground beneath them had just been pulled away. Everything they had built, every step they had taken, had led them to this, betrayed by their own, and the truth still just out of reach. The chase wasn't over. It had only taken a darker turn, and the game they were playing had just raised the stakes far beyond what they imagined. The air in the small cabin was heavy with tension. Detective Navarro paced back and forth, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Across the table, Rebecca sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her mind racing through every detail they had uncovered. Outside, the night was silent except for the occasional howl of the wind sweeping through the trees. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that hides something explosive beneath it. Navarro finally stopped pacing and looked at Rebecca. "It all fits, doesn't it?" he said in a low voice, his eyes sharp. "Every lead we've chased, every dead end, they weren't mistakes. Someone has been steering us in this direction." Rebecca nodded slowly, but her stomach twisted with unease. She had suspected the same thing, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. The person behind this wasn't just clever. They were 2 steps ahead, always predicting their moves, almost like they were in the same room, watching. The sound of a car door slamming outside made them both jump. Navarro reached for his sidearm and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure walking toward the cabin. Rebecca's heart hammered as she recognized the silhouette. It was someone they both knew, someone they never expected to see here. "Stay calm," Navarro whispered, but his grip on the gun tightened. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges, and the figure stepped inside. It was Assistant Director Monroe, their boss. Rebecca froze. She had spoken to him on the phone less than an hour ago, and he had sounded miles away, sitting safely in his office. Yet here he was, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you two doing here?" Monroe asked casually, as if he didn't already know. Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Navarro. Something was wrong. There was no reason for Monroe to be here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, unless he was part of something bigger. Navarro's voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp. "We could ask you the same thing, sir." Monroe smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've done good work. Better than I expected. But this is where your part ends." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. His tone wasn't congratulatory. It was final, like a door closing behind them. Before she could respond, the faint hum of another engine echoed in the distance. Navarro glanced toward the window and saw a black SUV pulling up behind Monroe's car. Doors opened, and 2 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark suits, and even from here, Rebecca could see the faint bulge of weapons under their jackets. Navarro took a step forward, his voice tense. "What's going on, Monroe? Who are they?" Monroe didn't answer. Instead, he moved fully into the cabin, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. "You were never supposed to get this far. The files you found, the names, they were meant to keep you occupied, not lead you here. But you kept digging." He paused, his gaze settling on Rebecca. "Especially you." Rebecca felt her throat tighten, but she refused to back down. "You've been controlling this from the start," she said quietly. "Every case, every lead, it all comes back to you." Monroe's expression hardened. "You don't understand what's at stake. This isn't about you or me. It's bigger than both of us. And if you want to walk away from this, now's the time." The door burst open before he could say more, and Navarro spun around, gun raised. But it was too late. The men from the SUV were inside, weapons drawn. Everything happened in seconds. Rebecca dove for cover as shots exploded through the room, wood splintering, glass shattering. Navarro returned fire, forcing the men back toward the doorway, but they were outnumbered and trapped. Rebecca crawled toward the back door, her ears ringing from the gunfire. She shouted for Navarro, but when she looked back, she saw Monroe standing perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, untouched, almost calm, as if he knew how this would end. She pushed through the door and stumbled into the freezing night air. Trees loomed on all sides, shadows twisting under the moonlight. Behind her, more gunfire erupted, then silence. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against a tree, her mind spinning. Was Navarro still alive? Could she trust anyone now? The crunch of footsteps on snow made her freeze. She turned slowly, expecting Monroe, or worse, but what she saw made her blood run cold. It was Jeremy, the man they thought was dead, the man who started all of this. He looked almost exactly the same as the day he vanished. No signs of age, no scars from the chaos he had left behind. His eyes locked on hers, calm and unblinking, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly, his voice carrying an eerie calmness that made her skin crawl. Rebecca's throat went dry. "You were supposed to be gone." Jeremy tilted his head slightly, almost curious. "Gone? No. I've been waiting. For you." Before she could respond, a scream tore through the night. A man's voice, raw and desperate. "Navarro." Rebecca spun toward the sound, but when she turned back, Jeremy was gone, vanished into the darkness like smoke. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She ran back toward the cabin, her breath coming in harsh bursts, her boots crunching through snow. The door hung open, swinging on its hinges. Inside, the lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls. Blood stained the wooden floor, and one of the suited men lay motionless near the doorway. Navarro was on his knees in the center of the room, his hands bound behind his back. Monroe stood behind him, holding a gun to his head. When he saw Rebecca, Monroe smiled. Not the friendly smile of a boss, but something darker, something final. "This ends now," he said. Rebecca froze in the doorway, her mind racing. She had no weapon, no backup, no time. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a movement in the shadows. Jeremy, standing there, watching, waiting. The air felt charged, heavy with a choice that would change everything. And then Monroe pulled the trigger. The night air was calm again, the chaos that had once gripped the city finally giving way to a fragile silence. The investigation had reached its end, but the weight of everything that had unfolded still lingered in the hearts of those who had lived it. Navarro walked slowly down the steps of the federal building, his shoulders no longer tense, but his mind still replaying the moments that brought them here. Rebecca joined him, her expression carrying both relief and an exhaustion that words couldn't quite express. They had fought against forces much larger than they ever expected, uncovering the tangled web that had been hidden in plain sight, and now it was time to take a breath. In the weeks that followed, the city began to heal. Reports that once spread fear now spoke of justice being served and the truth finally emerging from the shadows. The families who had been waiting for answers started to receive them, piece by piece. It wasn't a sudden relief, but rather a slow, steady process, one that came with its own questions. People wanted to know how something so intricate and well-hidden had gone unnoticed for so long. The answers weren't easy, and they weren't neat. But there was honesty now, and that mattered. Rebecca spent several days visiting the families most deeply affected. She didn't speak as an agent in those moments, but as a person who understood the pain of waiting for closure. She sat with them in their living rooms, listened to their fears and their frustrations, and explained what had been done to ensure such a breach would not happen again. Navarro joined her in some of those visits, though often he preferred to stand back, giving them the space to share their thoughts openly. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it wasn't something that could be forced. It had to grow naturally over time. The story that had unfolded was already being told across newspapers, television, and online channels. Each headline carried fragments of what had really happened, though very few could capture the quiet sacrifices made behind closed doors or the tension that lived in every step of the investigation. There were critics, as there always are, some saying the operation should have been faster, others questioning whether all the truths had been revealed. Rebecca and Navarro both knew that public perception would take time to align with the full picture, but they also knew they had done everything they could. One evening, as the sun set in soft orange hues over the city skyline, Rebecca stood at her window with a cup of coffee in hand. The case files lay closed on her desk, a small reminder of how much had been fought for and how much had been lost along the way. There were names in those files she would never forget, victims who had unknowingly become part of something much larger than themselves, and brave individuals who had stepped forward when silence would have been easier. She thought about the moments when the outcome could have shifted with a single choice, the moments when giving up had felt like an easier path, and how each time they had chosen to press forward. Navarro called her later that night. His voice was lighter than it had been in months, though still marked with that steady tone of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. They spoke not of the investigation itself, but of what came next. There were other cases waiting, other people needing help. This was the nature of their work. One chapter closed, another one already forming on the horizon. Yet both of them knew this case would stay with them, shaping the way they approached everything from here on out. The unexpected twist in their journey, the one that had changed the trajectory of the entire operation, had also led to reforms that were already starting to take effect. Departments were being retrained, new checks were being implemented, and protocols that had long been ignored were now under renewed scrutiny. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't fast, but it was progress. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense that the system was beginning to listen to the voices that had been crying out for change. As weeks turned into months, the city began to find its rhythm again. The streets that had once felt tense and watchful were now open and steady. People talked about the case in coffee shops and community meetings, some with lingering anger, others with cautious hope. The keywords that had dominated search engines, investigation, truth, conspiracy, justice, slowly faded into more hopeful phrases: rebuilding, accountability, healing. Life was moving forward, and though scars remained, they were no longer fresh wounds. Rebecca and Navarro met one last time in the park where they had first discussed the strange clues that led them down this path. The trees rustled softly in the evening breeze as they walked the same path, this time without urgency, just two people reflecting on what they had endured. Navarro joked about how they both needed a break, maybe somewhere quiet where the only mystery was deciding what to have for breakfast. Rebecca laughed, the kind of laugh that came not from joy alone, but from the relief of having made it through. Before they parted, they stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. There was no grand speech, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet understanding that they had done their part, and that was enough for now. The case would live on in reports and memories, but their work was already shifting to the next call, the next question that needed answers. For the people who had followed this story from the beginning, the resolution was more than just the end of a case. It was a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how powerful truth becomes when it finally comes to light. It showed that even in the darkest corners, where secrets are buried and hope feels distant, persistence and integrity can change the course of events. The lessons were not written in bold headlines, but in the small moments of courage that built towards something larger. As the night grew darker, the city seemed calmer than it had in a long while. There would always be more work to do, more questions to ask, more wrongs to make right. But for now, there was a rare and welcome sense of completion. And in that quiet, there was also a promise, not of perfection, but of continued effort, the kind that keeps stories like this from repeating themselves.